with the purchase of Alaska, um, you have suddenly a change of fate for Alaska natives in the sense that what had before been a relatively largely unoccupied subcontinent is now going to become very colonized rather quickly. That's not to say that during the Russian occupation, Alaska Native peoples had not been affected. Some Alaska Native peoples had been extremely affected. Kodiak Island, for example, went from having 30 different native villages to having about 12 that were sort of forceful relocations going on. The Unungan population was devastated in many cases due to Russian involvement in the area. Not gone, but certainly decreased substantially. Kenai smallpox epidemic. Definitely in the area where there were colonizers, the effects were transformative and often very negative. At the same time, you definitely had large swaths of Alaska at the point when the US purchases it that really have been just barely explored and not really colonized at all. Um, and indeed, it will remain that way for a few decades. When during the early American period, sort of for the very start, from 1867 to 1884, the U.S. doesn't do much with. Well, it starts doing some things with Alaska, but Alaska is still not nearly as populated as it's going to be. It's during this time the U.S. leads a lot of expeditions to sort of map out Alaska and better understand its geography and ethnography. It's during this time that they attempt to make a Western Union telegraph line between Alaska and Siberia to sort of connect the US's telegraph lines all the way into sort of that half of Asia and Russia and things. I always forget that Western Union is not just a way you can wire money to people that don't have online banking, but that it was actually like a telegraph company. I guess I didn't realize that. Anyways, so you have that actually never worked out the way it was supposed to. The telegraph line was never fully connected, but in the exploration for that telegraph line, a lot of Alaska was explored that paved the way for other things, such as Alaskan road system. And it was also sort of symbolic of the fact that Alaska at this point, whereas before had been mostly part of sort of the Russian economic regime, Alaska is now sort of being pulled into a broader global economic order due to the US's involvement. There's also sort of this theme at this point of cartography as colonialism in the sense that to control a territory, you have to map and understand the territory, and that's a lot of what's going on during this time period. At this point, the Alaska is managed under what's referred to as the Department of Alaska. It's not even really technically a territory or a district at this point. Then you have the early American period from 1884 to 1912, when things start to become much more prominent. It becomes a district, quote unquote, and you have a few different things. First of all, the sort of late 1800s is when you start to get a really significant whaling industry in the coastal parts of Alaska, which is very important, as well as sea otter hunting and hunting of other animals within this area, which has a really devastating effect for some native groups. So, for example, Unungan people in the Aleutian Islands have to deal with the fact that prey animals that they would have traditionally used for food as a primary food source, and then also for the skins to coat kayaks and thus allow for transportation to allow for hunting of their food, that these animals are being severely depleted. The bowhead whales almost entirely extinct at this point as a result of the whaling. So this has a big effect on native cultures. At the same time, this is also when you start to see the canneries be established and the fisheries, the commercial fisheries, which the canneries then sometimes became a source of native employment as well. So in that regard, both offering sort of opportunities for wealth creation, but also sort of assimilating or at least bringing indigenous people into sort of an American economic regime and a global economic regime. You have the start of the Alaska Railroad system, well, really the formation of it from 1902 to 1914, from Seward up to Fairbanks. You also have sort of, again, you got the whaling ships and everything, and so you're starting to see more more Euro-American settlers, but it's in 1896 to 1899 that things really get going with the discovery of gold. First, there's gold discovered over in Yukon Territory, which leads people to believe there's probably gold in Alaska as well. And indeed, in that time period, a few years later, I think it's 1899, is when what river is it? Swanson River? Yeah, Swanson River. Gold is discovered on the Kenai Peninsula, And then a few years later, gold is discovered up in. Oh, I'm sorry, I got that history totally wrong. I was doing the oil when oil was discovered. Ignore what I just said about the Swanson River. Your professor's a dummy. Okay, sorry. So there was gold discovered in Yukon Territory and then in, I believe it's sort of northwestern Alaska. And so then you have the Alaskan gold rush, the Klondike gold rush, and really population explosion. You suddenly have thousands of settlers from the lower 48 coming in. And so suddenly an area that had really been just resource colonialism all along now starts to feel a little bit more like settler colonialism, where sort of the settlers are coming and laying down stakes and forming actual communities. And so you have Nome in 1901 and Fairbanks in 1902. So it's starting to be less of just sort of this far off resource colony that people sort of lightly, sort of not too ton of a presence, and starts to be more of where there's actually true large settlements from American colonizers, which matters if we start to think about sort of native displacement that will eventually happen in some of the areas. So then in the early American period from 1912 to 1915, you see Alaska turn from a district into a territory, and you see rapid expansion of the population. This is the time period where we get Anchorage, Wasilla in 1914. By the end of it, we get Soldotna in 1960. And part of what's going on here is a lot of displacement of native groups in some areas. So I should clarify, a lot of the Alaska native villages and communities have been there since time immemorial and are still there. But this was a time period where you saw some native communities getting displaced, and displaced pretty rapidly. So the history of Anchorage is a history, as you've already kind of read about, of Dena'ina people getting displaced pretty quickly from traditional fishing camps in the area, and not with all of the sort of formalities that might have accompanied this if this had been the lower 48 back in the early 1800s, right? The power dynamic was different. And the displacement happened quite rapidly and pretty dramatically. And as a result of some of these large communities, as well as the earlier effects of whaling and commercial fishing, and just displacement from certain fishing grounds, you start to see for some groups a decline of subsistence. Let's see, for some. Other groups, though, for many groups at the same time, traditional subsistence was and is still very prominent. So it was kind of a mixed variety depending on where you were located in the state as a Native person, as well as to what degree you were part of the now sort of urban areas that were being set up. In 1935, Mat-Su Valley starts to receive a bunch of, this is during the Great Depression, so sort of immigrants from colder northern states that Teddy Roosevelt and others thought would do well in Alaska are sort of relocated up there for farmland, cheap farmland. And indeed, the kind of theme of homesteading keeps going. After World War II, you have homesteading, sort of these plots of land given to veterans. Now, a lot of times this homesteading happened in areas that had not really ever been ceded from Alaska natives. So homesteading here in the Kenai Peninsula, for example, it was just sort of land that was not being sort of actively resisted U.S. control, and the U.S. sort of gave the land, had claimed the land as U.S. public land and divvied it out to settlers. World War II also saw militarization, military bases set up in Anchorage and other places, and some of this had a pretty dramatic effect on indigenous people, such as there was a couple of the Aleutian Islands that were occupied by Japan at one point for a couple of years. And so the theme kind of for this slide that I'm talking about is displacement at the margins. And what I mean by that is people that have sort of been either pushed out of their territory or a lot of times still sort of in the territory, but maybe not in all of the territory because parts now are starting to be occupied and carved out as sort of settler colonizing spaces. And then so kind of displacement again at the margins, as well as destruction at the margins in the sense that, of course, the Aleutian Islands were relatively unprotected, and that's why they were able to be occupied during the military conflict between Japan and the U.S. During this time period of sort of 1912 to 1959, this time period immediately prior to statehood, you have a struggle for Alaska Native civil rights. And so you did a reading about this that I thought was great. It was short but good. And you should have read about, among other things, the advocacy work of Elizabeth Ratrovich and her husband, and the work that she did and that other Alaska Native people did, such as Alaska Native Brotherhood, to work to end discriminatory business practices in Alaska. So, as this sign shows, right, there's a restaurant that's bragging about the fact that they don't have any Native workers. And that was common at the time for Native people to be excluded from restaurants and places of business in the same way that Black people were excluded from restaurants and places of business in the American South during this time period. And due to the advocacy and activism of many Native people, Alaska became really the first state to pass a true anti-discrimination bill, the likes of which would sort of, in the same vein as the kinds of anti-discrimination bills that would be passed by a lot of states and eventually the federal government a couple of decades later. So it's a fascinating history, and I think it's kind of a good place to sort of start to close out this lecture because it shows that despite smallpox epidemics, despite kidnappings and violence, despite displacements and being pushed to the margins, Alaska Native people have resisted and have been active in their communities and have fought for their own visibility and have gained back rights. And so it's a sort of an important that we recognize when we talk about colonialism. The effects in many cases were devastating, right? Many islands in the Aleutian Islands, severe depopulation as a result. Severe depopulation at one point of denying a population due to smallpox. You have killings of people by colonizers. You have all sorts of very dramatic negative consequences. But you also have it's not just a story of victimhood, it's also a story of agency and of people taking control or pushing for the rights for their people and the ongoing sovereignty and survivance. That'll be an important theme to remember as we go next week into discussions of statehood and ANTH and how that all went down. I'll kind of give you a little sneak peek here, and then we'll talk more about it next week. Statehood gets granted in 1959. There had been a push since the early 20th century to make Alaska into a state rather than just a district or a territory. However, a lot of people felt, again, this kind of idea of barrenness, that there wasn't enough there, that it'd be difficult to control. You have then the 1957 Swanson River oil discovery here on the peninsula, which sort of rushes the matter to the attention more of the U.S. Congress, and statehood's passed pretty soon thereafter, and definitely the oil boom was part of that. It's during this time that a rather large amount of land is taken out of Native control, land that had been, in theory, marked off as U.S. public land and now was, in theory, given to Alaska State, and Alaska State was allowed to, as it was forming a state, take lands and put them into private ownership / state ownership. And yet, as they were doing that, despite the directions of the federal government, as the state was forming, lands from Native people were sort of taken out from under their feet often, which leads to the eventual land dispute in the late 60s, which eventually leads to Alaska Native Claims Settlement Act, which leads to kind of where we are today. But a theme here is sort of economic control and dispossession, right, as oil is discovered and as there suddenly becomes this very strong resource. So we kind of see yet again this theme of colonialism is about control and resources. Difficult topic to talk about colonialism. It's not an enjoyable topic. The readings are not enjoyable. At the same time, I hope we've seen that Alaska Native people had agency and resistance, and then also I hope we see that sort of this history can help us better understand where things stand today. Thank you so much.